Hello and welcome back to the Champagne Rugby podcast. In this episode, we will be talking about women's rugby, the women's Premiership final, England versus Japan, as well as the British and Irish Lions. On this week's episode of the podcast, we have Jack Goldberg from Saracens Amateur Rugby Football Club, and he'll be telling us all about the House of Hope Sevens, as well as the Amateur Rugby Saracens Club team. Jack, how are you doing?
Hamish, I'm very well, thank you. It's good to be on.
It's a pleasure to have you, my friend. Pleasure to have you. For the people that are listening, just give us a quick background on yourself and who is Jack and what is sort of Saracens amateur rugby sort of about.
So I'm 31. I'm a PE teacher. I work at Mill Hill School in Northwest London, and for the last 5 years, I've been head coach of the Saracens Amateur Men's Seniors. So that's the first and the second, and then post COVID, actually progressed into more of a director of rugby role, so overseeing the quality of coaching and the general rugby that is played at Saracens Amateurs. It's a great job, absolutely love it. I've played at the club since I was 8, so yeah, pretty much bleed it, and I think we're going in a very positive direction. And yeah, we're very excited for the upcoming season from under sixes through to the seniors, the vets, and we've got a pretty well established, although still in its infancy, Sonic section, which is our girls from kind of under 10s up to under 16, 17s as well.
So what's sort of the difference between Saracens Professional Club and Saracens Amateur? I'm sure you get it all the time.
We do. And actually in 2026 is the 150th year of Saracens as a brand, as an organisation. So we're looking to try and build more and more connections or re-establish connections between the amateur section and the professional club. So professionalism occurred in 1995 and Saracens since 1939 played at Bramley Road, which is where we still play. So our clubhouse is awash with history. On the honours board, you've still got your Francois Pinards, your Richard Hills, your Neil de Cox, some of the legends of the club. But we equally now in 2005-06 season, when the amateur section kind of re-emerged after the professionals moved to play at Vicarage Road, which is where Watford Football Club play. We've kind of, built and built and built, and we're getting to a point now where I think we've got 350, 400 active members, all the way from under sixes up to the seniors. And we're looking to kind of push and build the club to as bigger heights, not quite as the professional club, I imagine, but get higher up the leagues in the seniors and just provide an environment that everybody really enjoys to play their rugby in.
So what division is the men's first team in?
So our men's first team play in Herts, Middlesex Counties 2, which is level 8 in the rugby pyramid. In 2015, we were level 10, so we've kind of gone up the 2 levels in the last 9 seasons, of which in the last 2 seasons at level 8, we've finished 4th in both seasons. So we've effectively finished the highest in the pyramid we ever have done. We've got some really talented 16s, 17s and 18s coming through, and we're just trying to make sure that we can provide a level of rugby in an environment that's really going to excite them and entice them to want to stay. Some of them might aspire to play national level rugby, if not higher. But if we build on the 2 fourth place finishes over the last 2 seasons and hopefully look to, fingers crossed, get promoted this year. Level 7 rugby is old money London 1, and that could be really exciting.
So have you had any sort of standout players that have sort of come through the ranks and gone on to play some high level pro rugby, maybe for Saracens or thereabouts?
Yeah, absolutely. So he was actually in my age group. So Nick Autorak, who we played under 15s, under 16s together. He then went to Oaklands College, which was, or still is, the Saracens kind of ace academy. He signed a professional contract with Saracens at 18, and he then went on to play for Saracens, Bar, Saints, Quins, maybe not in that order. I think it was Saints, Quins, and more recently Edinburgh. And then retired from professional rugby this year. I've been putting a lot of effort into trying and entice him out of retirement and come and play some level 8 rugby back home. I think him in the front row, I think we would be a pretty dominant force up front if he came and played. So I'm still working on him. So fingers crossed. We've currently got 2 former youth players in the England under-20s who are in South Africa at the moment, playing in the Rugby World Cup. So that's Afo Fasogbon. He was in the London Irish Academy. As a Middlesex club, we generally have fed London Irish, and unfortunately with London Irish going under, we now come under the Saracens umbrella. And also Junior Kapoku, whose 2 older brothers Joel and Jonathan have played professional rugby as well. I think it's Joel Kapoku who's currently at Lyon, so they're quite a high-level rugby playing family, but Junior was actually in the club on Friday night doing a few sprints on the pitch before he flew to South Africa on Saturday, I believe, to go out to the under-20s Rugby World Cup. So yeah, we've had a handful of pretty able players come through the club.
And you mentioned you got a solid women's program. What sort of level were they playing at?
So we don't have women's yet. We've got the girls from under 10s, 12s, 14s, and 16s. We actually only started the women's or girls section officially last season, and we probably started with maybe 10 players, and they now train on a Thursday every night at 6:30 till 8 at the club. And we built from 10 this time last year up to about 50 from under 10s through to under 16s, which is amazing. Our kind of head of girls rugby, Nash Cohen, has done an incredible job. And the aspiration is, similarly with the professional club in 1995, moving away from Bramley Road with the professionalism of rugby, when the women decided to move away from Bramley Road to the Stonex, or at the time the Allianz, women's rugby kind of ceased, unfortunately, at the club. Girls could always play youth rugby from under 6s through to under 11s, but under 12s, they then have to differentiate off and play girls only rugby. They can't play with the boys. And we just didn't have the capacity or provision. Now we do. It's a really thriving and biggest growth part of the club, and something we're very excited to kind of continue to push, and we celebrate a lot.
It's interesting because the Saracens women's Prem team, they're really strong. They've won the cup 3 times, and they've got to the semis in this round just gone, but obviously Gloucester Hartbury won it there. So I'm surprised that yeah, it's interesting to sort of see how women's rugby is developing in Middlesex and the sort of North London area. What's your sort of, yeah, how has it sort of been? Have you been involved at all with the women's side of things for the women's Saracens pro squad at all?
Not personally, and as a club, no. I mean, what we've been able to do is, I think it's been a really good segue into, like I mentioned earlier, trying to re-establish some of those connections between ourselves as the amateur club and the professional club. So we named our girls' club the Saracens Amateur Sonics after Sonia Green, who is the most capped Saracens female player. In a kind of nod to her, she's been down a couple of times as well to kind of coach and inspire the girls, which has been great. We recently had Ella Wyers, who is a young scrum half at Saracens Women's as well, come down and take a session with the girls, and they just respond so positively to that. It's so important that, you know, the girls have real visibility in terms of role models, and I think that has been a huge barrier to young girls taking up rugby down the years where it hasn't been as mainstream. So it's kind of the commercial side of women's rugby increases, and how visible it is, whether it's on TV, whether it's in social media. I mean, social media is so big for sports clubs at the moment, and especially, you know, with younger people, where social media is probably their go-to search engine. They'll see it there, and you know, I think whilst we haven't necessarily had a specific influence, we've had conversations with Mark Thompson, who's the new CEO of Saracens, the Saracens Group, which is really exciting. We've now got a liaison specifically at Saracens to kind of help us and support us with our girls section and how we can drive that more. So we've definitely made some of the right steps to keep progressing in that sense.
What's your thoughts on the current state of the women's game?
I really like it. I mean, rugby generally, I think financially, you know, is in a pretty difficult position, with obviously a handful of like men's professional clubs, unfortunately, going into liquidation. And that, I think, of course, being such a big moneymaker, will have a knock-on effect, I guess, to the women's game. Outside of the women who are kind of able and lucky enough to get central contracts from England Rugby, and then obviously I believe there's some match fees on top. I think from a commercial aspect, I think there still needs to be greater visibility, greater opportunities for sponsors to kind of invest in the game, make it an opportunity where outside of England central contracts, there is career opportunities that women can live off. You know, I think a lot of professional women's rugby players still will hold other jobs, and will still have to have other employment. That means that it takes away from their opportunities to get the level of training, the access to physiotherapy, sports psychology, perhaps, that the men's game has obviously had for a number of years now. And whilst obviously it's not to say that it can't happen, I just think it's a much slower process, because we're still yet to probably benefit from what I think is an evident increase in the number of girls playing rugby in their kind of early years, whether it's kind of pre 10 years old or in their teens. you see a lot of uptake of girls rugby actually kind of in their mid-teen years. So there is that slightly longer skill acquisition curve for them to get to a level where they can perhaps play the professional game. But more and more are taking it up younger, and their skills coming through at 15, 16, 17 are remarkable. And they will make a massive difference to both the professional club game, but also on the international stage in kind of 5, 10 years' time.
Yeah, I think the women's rugby as a whole is actually one of the fastest growing sports in participation in the world in terms of increase in percentages. And if you look at it from, you mentioned being sustainable economically and sponsorship point of view. If you look at that from a business point of view, then if you're an investor and you think, all right, I'm going to invest X amount into this business, and the rate of growth of women's rugby is so exponential right now, you look at that and you think, actually, that's quite a good investment. So if I was an investor looking at women's rugby as a business prospect, then I would say women's rugby could be quite a profitable niche. Obviously, there's a lot of different ways that you go about making that a proper business, but rugby and sport as a whole, if you look at American sports, for example, they've managed to turn their sports into businesses and grown that into creating more and more opportunities for players and coaches, for people to make a living from what they love doing, which is playing the sport. And I think rugby's sort of, like you said, we've only been professional for less than 30 years. So we've got a lot of catching up to do in terms of professionalism of the sport. But I guess it's the key question is, when should women's rugby be fully professional? Because on the one hand, you could say it's not big enough right now. It doesn't have the right viewership to be fully professional. So it'd be sort of a lot of money down the drain, and it wouldn't grow sustainably. But yeah, what are your thoughts? When do you think women's rugby should be fully professional?
Um, Personally, I think it's got to be a point at which, one, obviously the businesses themselves obviously have to be sustainable over a longer period of time, where there is no fear of perhaps throwing around match fees or salaries that means that they therefore can't sustain that. I think whether it's I know obviously you've got the kind of Premiership men's have always had different sponsors, whether it's Aviva, whether it's Gallagher. I'm sure there are other sponsors out there. But in terms of having a business that perhaps is not necessarily willing to make a loss, but it's about the sponsorship and the commerciality, about really kind of investing in what the core values of the sport are. And I think if once you get to a point where they are sustained, I think you're going to have a supply line of players that will look after it. I think it's got to be, it can't be top down. It's still got to be bottom up. So I think that investment has to be at a grassroots level as well, because if you throw around X salaries that might benefit a lot of players and a lot of clubs in the short term, if there isn't that supply line of players to supplement that in 5, 10, 15 years time, it's a complete non-starter. So I think it's, got to look at the bottom of that pyramid first, and whether it's the investment, if there's better kind of TV packages, whether it's TNT or BT, whether it's Sky, whether it's terrestrial. How good would it to be to see women's sport televised live on terrestrial TV that absolutely everyone can access, where it's not paid for, where it's not a package that perhaps isn't affordable to some socioeconomic groups. I think, at that point, when there's greater viewership, greater exposure, and all of a sudden you've got role models for younger female rugby players, I think that at that point you can probably say this is going to be really sustainable.
What were your thoughts on the sort of the streaming channels hosting rugby sports? Like I think they've got Rugby Pass TV now, for owned by World Rugby. They just showed the England Japan game. Do you think that's a alternative, a good option for watching live games?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, any way to make sports accessible for free. I think you've got a lot of it. I know kind of Amazon and Prime kind of dipped into the Six Nations kind of in and around COVID. And I know TikTok, I think, sponsored the balls of both that and the Women's Six Nations as well. I think all of a sudden it makes it very relatable to a much younger audience. And whilst the game fundamentally hasn't changed to make it accessible to a different demographic, like use the 100 in cricket, for example, they're trying to target a very different audience to make the game really exciting. and something that they're going to want to kind of buy into and invest time and energy and emotion in. No, I like it. I think if you can make that visible on social media, especially, Rugby Pass, the same way Champagne Rugby will obviously utilize kind of Instagram, TikTok, Twitter. All of a sudden it's much more in the palm of your hand, quite literally. And someone could be sat on a bus watching England v Japan, and yeah, very, very accessible. YouTubers and content creators, yeah, that if they're kind of buying into that environment as well, that yeah, definitely a platform that will support viewership in the younger age groups.
Did you manage to watch the England-Japan game on the weekend?
I did. I thought it was a good game. I thought England have had their kind of ups and downs under Borthwick. There's a lot of criticism kind of thrown about the brand of rugby that we wanted to play. Don't get me wrong. I think he inherited a poison chalice to some extent. I think Eddie Jones did incredible things for England rugby, but I think we got to a point where that change was required. And I had to take my hat off to anyone coaching, not just in an elite level, but on the international stage where the pressures of the media, of like the whole country, I guess, kind of being on top of you, you've got to be pretty headstrong to make a decision, stick to the decision, and kind of see through your approach, even if it's not working to some extent. There's got to be that kind of cooling off period. And I think the Japan team, whilst competitive, I think there's an element of Japan still living off their win against South Africa in the Rugby World Cup, arguably one of the greatest upsets in sport. No, I think they were. I think it was a generally positive improvement on what we've perhaps seen over the last couple of years.
Who do you think were sort of the standout players that stood out to you on the weekend?
Um, I think it's hard to look past some of your Chandler Cunningham Souths. Some of the younger players on the back row, really impactful. I think we've kind of spoken about the kind of debate around that kind of 6, 7, 8 axis. Who's going to slot into where? If you don't have a historical England relying on a Billy Vunipola, for example, carrying off the back of a scrum or in and around those kind of narrower fringes around the breakdown, I think he offers that physicality both in attack and defence. Then you've got your Sam Underhill, who's just an absolute mentalist, throws his head into the spokes, but kind of gets that really unseen, dirty work done. Then you've obviously got your kind of Currys, your Jack Willises, definitely a kind of option of someone who's going to hopefully come and continually come back into the side. You don't see someone go and win the Champions Cup and then not necessarily get a look in the international side, especially the performances that he's put in. But no, I think Chandler Cunningham South was definitely a standout for me on the weekend.
Do you think Jack Willis should be included in the squad? Do you think breaking the overseas rule and bringing in a player that's been playing in France, do you think it will be good for the team? I mean, short term, it'll be great for the team, right? Because you've got one of the best out and out six set flankers in the game. And yeah, what's your thoughts?
Um, it's an interesting one because I think obviously like Australia have always had that kind of Gitto rule where if you've played a certain number of games and then you move abroad, you warrant still being selected. I understand completely the idea of not allowing it because I think it obviously keeps the best players in England under RFU central contracts, so they have a greater control, and it means that they can have them exactly when they want them through all Six Nations, all major tournaments, and also perhaps improves the quality of the domestic game here, creates again greater role models and supports players coming up through academies, perhaps if they have access to those players. If you were to say that, there would probably be a greater exodus, and there probably already has been to some extent, to your kind of top 14s where there is a huge lure of greater financial pay. Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I think it can't be horses for courses. I think it has to be the same rule for everyone. I think Jack Willis just gives that little point of difference in the back row. He's so disruptive at the breakdown. Not that your Underhills and your Currys aren't, but his build, his centre of gravity, his ability to find himself in tight spaces, winning ball, turning over possession, I think is so vital in today's game when everything's so fast paced, so physical. He picks his moments, but when he does pick them, he's very effective.
And what's your thoughts on the England 10 shirt position? Who do you think's putting up their hand? You've got Smith and Smith playing, Marcus and Finn. Do you think how do you think they got on? Because for me, one of the standout players of the weekend was actually Marcus Smith, someone that offers a very attacking threat. And against Japan, he had a lot of space to play with, and I think he was one of the key, despite the yellow card, was one of the key game changers in that game. Do you think England's missing the Ford and Farrell axis that they've relied on for so long?
I think with the Ford and Farrell axis, I'm a fly half myself. I think the kind of both Ford and Farrell offer perhaps a really organised, structured game of rugby that has been so probably we've been accustomed to, not just from an England perspective, but I think internationally it is very different to a, say, ring fence premiership where there's no risk of relegation. It doesn't matter. And I think there's always been that debate with Marcus Smith whether he can transfer his flair and his success in the domestic game into the international stage, where actually playing for territory, managing the game over 80 minutes has such a much greater weighting on it in terms of the outcome by the end of it. I think Finn Smith probably gives you that more traditional 10, whether it's the distribution, whether it's the kicking, whether it's the management of forwards in their whatever system they're playing, whether it's like a 1-3-3-1 pods or whatever they want to play. I think he manages and stitches that really well together. But Marcus Smith can just change a game in a moment. I think he has that point again, similar to Jack Willis in the back row. He wins really important moments, and I think when you in the Six Nations, I think it can win you games. But I think the greatest structure, perhaps maybe that Finn Smith can offer, might win you tournaments. I think that's a really interesting kind of slant on the debate. But both of them, moving forward, are going to be huge from an England perspective because they complement each other. That you can change the game depending on whether you're ahead and want to manage, or whether you're behind and want to try and chase the game and create something a little bit different.
Yeah, because if you look at South Africa, you've got Manie Lubbock, who was the key sort of flair boy
Mm.
for South Africa. And then you've got Andre Pollard, who came in and won them the tournament. So it's really, like you said, is that the same scenario with Smith and Smith? But I don't know. Like
Yeah, quite.
part of me loves the champagne rugby that Marcus Smith brings to the table, and he's the Filipino flair. So for me, I'm
Yeah,
kind of hoping Marcus is our tournament 10 and as well as our flair 10. Maybe
I hope so.
that's some biased, but yeah. Do you think if Ford, Farrell, Smith, and Smith, they're all available? You've got the World Cup tomorrow. Who are you taking at 10? Who's it? Are you taking all of them? Like who's starting? Do you have Farrell at 12? Like who do you have?
Interesting. I'll put my kind of Saracens fan bias aside. Um, I think it's interesting. I mean, you could even argue, you could even change the question slightly to imagine if they're all the same age, all at the same time. Who do you pick in terms of whether it's the ability to manage the game, whether it's the ability to change the game? I think Farrell, and to be fair, Finn Smith and Marcus Smith probably will still grow into a level of leadership and perhaps even like social infamy that Farrell has. He can do right, he can do wrong, but it's so wrong in so many other people's eyes just because people fundamentally don't like others' success, especially if they've got a bit of swagger about them. And I think to be a professional sports person, whether it's cricket, whether it's rugby, football, you've got to have that not arrogance about you, but a level of confidence and a belief in your game that not that the external media pressure or noise doesn't impact you. But I think when Farrell's on the pitch, I think a lot of people around him appear to have greater confidence in their own ability. I think he makes things happen. I think he has interesting conversations with referees at times. There's been some good examples recently, but I think he manages those relationships with players, with officials, with the media, with the coaches really well. So I think Smith and Smith are perhaps yet to grow into that role. They may well be behind closed doors. We don't know. But no, I think Farrell for me, I think he's been one of the best players for England ever. And in the last 10 years internationally, he's got to be considered up there.
So World Cup final tomorrow, you're having Farrell as your 10,
I'm picking Farrell.
despite the non-Saracens bias, right?
Yeah, right, the non-Saracens bias.
Thought so. Anyway, if the England side, do you think this England side that we saw against Japan, do you think they could beat the All Blacks in 2 weeks' time?
Will be tough. I think whilst the All Blacks have obviously not been the kind of dominant force they have been over the last kind of 10, 15 years in the last couple. Obviously the England semi-final win away in Japan, was it 2019 World Cup was obviously incredible. Not that we're necessarily still dining off that, but I think that at that point, there was a general perhaps tide change in terms of this level of success that New Zealand have had since. Look, you can't ever write off New Zealand, and even if, similar to your last question, if there was a World Cup tomorrow, obviously your form sides are your South Africas, your islands. It's hard to look past France, even though they obviously didn't necessarily get the success they wanted more recently. They're an incredible side at the moment with incredible strength and depth. You only have to look at the pipeline of players coming through, not just the top 14, but the second and third tier of French rugby, where it's fully professional. Their second and third string teams are going to beat a lot of international sides as well. But you can never look past New Zealand. They're big game players. They play in a high level domestic competition against other very high level domestic and international players. I think it'll be tough. Obviously, home advantage. It's not home advantage. We are away, or is it in Japan?
It's in New Zealand, yeah.
In New Zealand. So again, even bigger. Where are they playing? Dunedin or Eden Park? Yeah, that's very few teams win there. So that's going to be really tough. From the side perspective, I think if the game breaks apart a little bit and we can, as you said, with your Marcus Smiths within that 10 jersey, should he be starting? If the game breaks apart, that's where maybe we can exploit and get some change. But yeah, very few teams go to New Zealand to win, so it's going to be pretty tough.
What's your starting back line for England, New Zealand?
In terms of starting, I think Alex Mitchell's been obviously pretty exceptional, both against Japan. I think consistently he probably offers the most. Little nod to, I actually really rate Rafi Quirk. Whilst he's not in the squad, I believe he's still at Sale. He's had a couple of injuries over the last couple of years, but I think he had a couple of games for England in the last few years, and I really like his kind of tenacity. He's aggressive around the breakdowns. He's not afraid to pick and go himself and get those snipes in and around just to get that extra meter or two. His distribution is great. So I'd love to see him kind of grow into something more within England over the next few years. But yeah, Alex Mitchell, Smith, we'll leave it there. Lawrence, Slade, Freeman on one, Faye Bosso on the other wing. I think, he's got just electric lightning pace that I think England necessarily haven't had for a while. I think, probably post Johnny May for the interesting character that he is. He gave us that direct straight line speed that we haven't always had the luxury of having. You probably look at like a Jason Robinson of years gone by. It's that kind of electricity that just opens up defences. And then I think Furbank's earned his place after his last few performances at 15. Whilst he's not your Freddie Stewart, perhaps in terms of his aerial ability, I think he slots in as that second playmaker at 15. If one of the Smiths is engaged in a ruck or finds himself out of position, he's played a bit at 10 for England. I'm also slightly biased here. I'm an old Bedfordian and he went to Bedford School, so I'm quite keen to see him do well as well. But no, I think Furbank has probably secured his place, at least for the time being, in that position, especially with Northampton Saints having such a high level of success. If they can imprint some of that attacking DNA onto the England side, if that's something to build around it, especially on the international stage, I think we're onto a pretty decent setup.
So pretty similar, exactly the same as Borthwick's squad against Japan. No changes.
Yeah, no changes. I think in terms of other players that could possibly come in, I mean, we generally have obviously a greater forward backs balance on the bench. I think in terms of other players in and around the circuit, I think Daly's always part of that conversation. I think he just offers a lot of versatility, whilst he might have fallen out of favour a little bit more recently. He's kind of always in that conversation around England because he can play kind of centre wing as well. And obviously his left foot offers a point of difference, but also I know Slade has that option as well. I would love to see Radwan have another go in the England side. Again, that electric pace that you just can't put a price on. There's no substitute for it at the elite level, whether it's size, physicality, or speed. He's a powerful rugby player. So he'll be there or thereabouts.
I'd love to see Radwan in the squad. He's a good player, really fast. But I think that's a good indication that Steve Borthwick's doing a good job, because I've got a very similar. I wouldn't change anything from Japan. I think against New Zealand, let's go with the same squad, build some continuity, and give some trust to the lads. So Borthwick, hats off to him. He's done some good squad selection there.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. I mean, there was who was it who also started the wing who made his debut this week? He may have come off the bench. Um,
One of the Northampton lads.
no, maybe Newcastle. He made his debut. Something we can come back to, but he got his first cap this weekend, and I think looked pretty composed as well. Roebuck, yes, Roebuck, that's the one. Again, I think he's really impressed in the domestic game over the last season. You know, and if you can get one really good fitness, but also string together a handful of games over the course of a season, not necessarily even try count, but you know, it's that kind of some of the metrics in terms of like meters post contact, whether it's defenders beaten, whether it's tries created, you know, or those kind of metrics and those stats paint a really positive picture. And I think across the course of the season, he's definitely been up there throughout them.
Yeah, Roebuck's definitely been up in the stats game. I don't have the exact stats on me, but I remember seeing some stuff online about what he's been up to. And yeah, I mean the season's sort of come to an end now. We just had the URC, quite a big weekend of rugby just gone. We just finished the Prem Rugby final, the for the women's, the Toulouse top 14. They've just finished
Yep.
up. You had Super Rugby final, Blues winning that, and Glasgow Warriors winning URC. So it's been sort of a wrap up weekend for the rugby before we're now on to the summer internationals. What's sort of been your highlight of the season? I don't know if you follow much Super Rugby top 14 or maybe it's just Prem, but what for you's been like a standout moment of this last season gone?
Um, I mean, in terms of obviously generally nosing out rugby full stop, I think some of the debates around, I mean, Glasgow winning the URC is pretty remarkable given the fact that, you know, they had to travel down to South Africa in a week's notice and beat a South African team in South Africa. You know, I think that's pretty special. Um, I think there's a lot to be said about some of the scores that have been recorded in a lot of those finals as well, especially when you go to some of your URC games. They're not, again, afraid to throw the ball around, even in difficult conditions. And I think higher scoring games are more and more prevalent at the moment. I know there's that traditional kind of English winter. If you win a game 12-9, you know, great game, 4 penalties versus 3 penalties. But actually, I think the game has changed in terms of the requirements of the players. There's another interesting debate there in terms of, I know Eddie Jones was very pro kind of reducing subs numbers and therefore the size of players would decrease because they have to last longer and then you get more free flowing games. But I think in terms of the quality of rugby across kind of domestic competitions, I think has improved. So not necessarily a specific moment, but I think across the game that it's a much more exciting game to look at. I think the international scene is probably where actually people come unstuck in terms of 3 minutes of kick tennis, perhaps. But again, the stakes and the importance of a specific moment or making an error in your own half in internationals is probably more fearful. They're more fearful of, so therefore the kicking game perhaps is slightly more prevalent. But no, I think the domestic game, domestic cups, I still think the jury's out slightly on South African teams in the URC. I think it has improved the quality of it, but I do get the kind of financial strain that it can put on, say, countries with different currencies, or also asking supporters, you know, to travel down to South Africa in peak times. It's pretty difficult.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely an issue. It's sort of the debate, do we have a sort of ground in Europe that the South African clubs can play in? But if you look at it from that point of view, then it's a really tough one because the travel is just so inconvenient. It's like a 10-hour flight and the teams are jet lagged. It's been going on all season. But I think with that aside, I think one of the highlights for me this season has sort of been seeing Dupont play in the Champions Cup final. And then less than a week later, he's playing in Madrid Sevens and goes on to win the Madrid Sevens as well. And literally single-handedly like winning the match for in the final there against Argentina. It's just quite an incredible spectacle to see. And so for
Yeah,
me, that
I
was
mean,
the highlight.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, he personally, sorry, is. I mean, he's just an exceptional rugby player, isn't he? In terms of his vision, the fact that he can kick 50-22s off both feet, box kick off both feet, step off both hands or both feet, hand off with both sides. He's, whilst obviously he's still ridiculously strong. He's not on the smaller side. What anyone else says, he's probably one of the most complete rugby players that has ever been, both physically, technically, tactically, in attack and defence. Yeah, if there's anyone, if you say to any new rugby player, this is what a rugby player should look like, it's got to be him.
He's a ball of tricks, and
He is.
it's a shame that he's not British or Irish. Because if we had him in our
Yeah.
British and Irish Lions squad, that would be pretty incredible. Talking of which, usually at this time of the year, we would be having the Lions series and the Lions tour. So the debate would be about, all right, who's in your Lions squad this year? Who's going to be facing Australia? So my question to you is, if the
Mhm.
Lions was this year, based on current form in the season just gone, who would be in? Who do you think's putting their hand up to be in the Lions squad? And who's going? Who's staying? What's your reasons? Yeah, who, talk us through.
Um, so I think obviously you generally go off on form right now, but also the most recent Six Nations. It's obviously the English and Irish sides, I think at the moment are obviously going to offer most players. Scotland have always had a handful of really good players, and I think obviously within that side you're looking at your Finn Russells in terms of your kind of main Scottish probably presence. Tuapolotu in the centres, I think has offered quite a lot over the last few years from a Scottish perspective. I know England's record against Scotland in the Six Nations over the last 5-6 years has been pretty poor, and Finn Russell and Tuapolotu have been pretty central to that. In terms of forwards, again, I think your only influence outside of England and Ireland is potentially Jack Morgan. I believe he's injured at the moment, but really young captain, clearly has a lot of characteristics and traits that the kind of Welsh setup really value in him. And, to make someone captain so young, but also as a back rower kicking 50-22s, he's got a little bit about him. Front row wise, I still think Jamie George as a hooker is definitely up there. And then you've got Porter and Furlong. I think they've been pretty sound performers over the last couple of years. It's going to be hard to dislodge them from those kind of starting jerseys. Itoje, you've got Ryan, the Irish second row, and I think probably the biggest conversation in the forwards is probably around the back row, because I think, as we've discussed with the England side, there's quite a lot of competition within those places. So I think Underhill's had a really good recent string of games for England, and again offers that physicality at the breakdown. We've spoken about Jack Willis. Curry's always a big influence in there. I think Ben Earl, obviously, I think gets a look in as well. Caelan Doris, Irish back row as well. I think, again, who's led from the front. His ball carrying off the base at the scrum has given the Irish side huge amounts of go forward, no matter who they play, wherever they are on the pitch, and gives them a platform either to score off or something where they can potentially exit from in their own 22 or half, depending on their game plan there. In terms of scrum halves, I think Alex Mitchell probably gets a look in. I think outside of Jameson Gibson Park, he's probably been a pretty consistent performer. And again, I think his speed of ball at the breakdown has probably been a huge uptick compared to, not to say that Danny Kerr and Ben Youngs haven't been exceptionally good for England over a number of years. I think Alex Mitchell just offers that slightly quicker ruck speed and that ball off the floor into 10. Finn Russell, I think, he's a pantomime character, but I think he, in a 3-match series, especially in the tests, I think he's going to make something happen. Both Smiths, I think Marcus Smith, did he go on the last Lions tour, Marcus Smith?
Yeah.
As a very young, non-England capped player. So, there's definite much more pedigree to his game since then. And, if you get selected then and not now, I'm sure that would be quite a weird place to be for him. But I think he definitely gets into that squad, even if it's not necessarily just a starting test 10. You've got your midweek franchise games and you've got the build up to it. He's definitely got to be thinking, I'm in with a shot here. In the centres, you've got your Bundiakis. I think Lawrence definitely gets a look in. You've got your Gary Ringroses, your Henshaws. I'm not sure on their injury status, but again, these are international performers who have kind of done it on the biggest stage. They've been on Lions tours before, and I think that experience is really hard to kind of overlook. And then finally, kind of in your back three, I think Fable Bosso probably maybe a bit of a bolter again. I think that electric pace will be really really exciting to see. James Lowe, he kicks the ball about 1,000 meters. He's got a real confidence about his game now, and I think as far as Ireland are concerned, he has been pretty exceptional. You know, I think he plays week in week out. He's had very few injuries, and every time he gets the ball, he looks incredibly dangerous. And his obviously his exiting defensive ability with his kicking has been pretty good. So that is currently where my head's at.
I agree with some of your team, but not all of your team. I'm interested. I'm curious that you didn't include Farrell, knowing you're biased towards Saracens. For me, Farrell's definitely one of the starters at 12, with Russell at
Okay.
10. He's done multiple tours since 2013, and he's been one of the form players for British and Irish Lions Saracens this season. I think it'd be a robbery not to have him in the squad. How dare you, Jack? How dare you?
I mean, to be fair, in terms of obviously thinking about most recent England performances, that's obviously an oversight from my perspective. I obviously assume, therefore, playing in France, that there's no kind of obligation to not play British and Irish Lions. There's no kind of national governing body legislation that says they can't play. So actually, yeah, definitely one to include.
then, then another one I think you missed out was Courtney Laws at number 6. He's my go-to 6 if I'm
Yeah,
looking at the Lions squad. Um, Wales got the wooden spoon, so I'm not so sure about Jack Morgan's captaincy and leadership there. Uh, Jokes aside, he is a great player, but
yeah,
Laws is the winning captain for the Prem and the standout player for that Northampton squad. It's
yeah,
a real shame that he's leaving to France, because I think he's got another. He hasn't ruled out the Lions, so he's said he'd still be around. So that's a good one. I agree with you. I'd have Willis in there at 7, and then I'd have Ben Earl at number 8. So an all England back row. And then the Irish dudes on the bench just to bring in that bolster. Because if you think about Australia and playing in Australia, it's a lot quicker game. So you want to have a bit quicker, fluid attack. Whereas I think the Irish setup is a bit more structured. So I'd probably have Ellis Genge at loose head instead of Andrew Porter. And Porter on the bench to sort of close out the game. And then for hooker, I'd go with Dan Sheehan. He's really impressed
yeah.
me. Six Nations, I think, is one of the top try scorers. So yeah, for me, he'd have to be in there, and maybe Duhan van der Merwe, top try scorer for the Six Nations. I think it would be a robbery to leave him out as well from that squad, and perhaps Slade at 13, the Premiership player of the year. He'd probably be my 13 in there. But apart from that, I think you got quite a solid squad. And we were saying sort of before the podcast, I was hearing your squad, and I think you were pretty much naming the exact same squad as me. So that's why I've come in with a few more controversial ones there. But yeah, I think if the Lions was playing tomorrow, who do you think would win the series?
I think the Lions would beat Australia in a current 3-match Test series. I
Three
think
0
there's. Well, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting because obviously looking at what I've seen, so I believe that Kurtley Beale has been brought back into the Australia setup recently, and whilst he's kind of had his times where he's been an exceptionally kind of able player and he's contributed hugely to Australian rugby, whilst he's not necessarily been in kind of like mainstream Australian kind of media at the moment. When you start to throw names in like that, all of a sudden people's ears kind of perk up and take notice, and all of a young side might, especially with some of the younger players in that line side, might go there and see Kurtley Beale, and all of a sudden the kind of pressure and the tension. And again, I think the line side, whilst I think on paper stronger, the travel, all the different influences that you have to compete with there, being away from family, whether it's jet lag, whether it's illness, whether it's a change in diet. Obviously, they'll take a huge backroom staff team over to make sure that the players are as kind of well looked after and as comfortable as possible. Winning any tour overseas, let alone winning at 3-0, is a ridiculously difficult task. But no, let's err on the side of caution. We'll go with a 2-1 Lions win.
2-1. Safe bet. A very safe bet. Talking of tours, it sort of comes to that time of the year, the summertime, when not so much 15s being played, but more sevens. You mentioned at the start of the podcast that you're organising House of Hope sevens this summer. Would you be able to sort of tell us a bit about what is House of Hope sevens and how was it started?
Of course. So, the House of Hope is a charity which is based in Hout Bay, which is about 20 kilometres around the coast from central Cape Town, in honour of my late grandfather. My grandfather was a political activist in apartheid South Africa and was one of the 8 men sentenced to life imprisonment at the Rivonia trials in 1964. So there's 8 men stood on the docks, Nelson Mandela being one of them, and two to his right was my grandfather. He spent 22 years in prison in Pretoria, and was released in, I believe, late 86. At which point my mum, my uncle, and my grandma had come to England on an ancestral visa because one of my grandparents, great grandparents' parents, was originally born in England, so they were able to come here and effectively get away from what was a pretty volatile and horrible situation, of course. Throughout his kind of life, he continued to be relatively politically active, both in once in England, and then in 2002 moved back to South Africa, got back involved in politics, and his last kind of wish, beyond creating the Denis Goldberg Legacy Foundation, which was a charity in his name, he wanted to create a House of Hope. So the House of Hope is attached to the Hout Bay Museum, and it's a centre where children, generally from quite extreme levels of poverty, can access things like drama, art, music, sports, languages, IT lessons. They do prenatal and antenatal classes for women, especially from specifically two townships where there's a high level of fetal alcohol syndrome, high levels of illiteracy, low levels of education. You know, there's such a need for these charities and organizations to be in place. And I think what this fundamentally does is the money that we raise at the sevens, which we run here, funds opportunities for those cultural capital increasing experiences for young children, men and women alike, to effectively improve their lives. So 2 years ago, we started the House of Hope Sevens, which we run at Saracens Amateur Rugby Club in North London, where we had simply 15 teams. It was a mixed competition, men's only sides. We were hoping to get a women's competition in, but just didn't quite materialise. But 15 teams, ran a mixed level competition, so a kind of tournament, if you will. And we, ran it, and it went really well. It was incredible. We raised about £1,100, so not huge amounts, but we slowly built and built and built. Last year was our second, so in 2023, where we had 25 teams. So we've increased the number of teams. We had a couple of women's teams only, so they played kind of a series across the course of the day against each other. But again, was a really important kind of signpost for me, especially with Saracens Amateurs, like I mentioned earlier, increasing our girls provision. I think that's really important for that to be visible at the tournament that we host. And then we've got our third instalment of the competition coming up on the 13th of July this year, where at the moment we are on track for about 30 to 32 teams. So again, we've grown. We play it across 3 or 4 pitches. The tournament lasts for a good 7 or 8 hours, but it's a really exciting competition. And we, luckily, with the number of teams we have now, have the option to run a men's open, so a slightly higher level open. So we're looking at probably level 7 and above. So we get a number of teams like the Egg Chase Alliance, for example, who will have players who play kind of in level 5, level 4, so kind of national level rugby in England. And then we also have kind of a men's social level 8 and below. A little bit of drinking involved throughout the day for some of these teams, but they really kind of buy in. It's been such an incredible environment. And then this year, I'm really pleased that we've actually got currently sevens women's teams. So we're actually still looking for one women's team who can join and make that tournament of 8 with 2 pools of 4. Every team is guaranteed at least 3, if not 4, pool games, depending on the balance of the 2 or 3 competitions, and guaranteed a semi-final. It's really exciting. We've got a range of incredible food vendors, from barbecue to paella to iced coffees to coconuts to shawarmas. We've got everything going. We've got an ice cream van. We've got a bit of an after party. And yeah, we're very excited to hopefully try and raise even more this year than we have over the last 2.
It's actually quite incredible, the journey that your grandfather went on to basically fight for his life, and then to see his journey encompassed into a rugby tournament that now continues his legacy and through the charity work that's changing lives. Yeah, it's just incredible work that you've done. So massive, massive like shout out to you and your grant and the team and everything that it stands for, and massive sort of pat on the back for what you guys are doing. It's truly incredible stuff, and great to see how sport can really change lives, and using that as sort of a pillar in many ways. What's sort of to be, if people want to sort of donate or fund, help with the donations and funding of this tournament, where could they do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a Instagram page, which is Denis Goldberg Legacy Foundation, or the House of Hope. We've also got our Sevens page, which you can navigate through to find it. We can also obviously put some links out there. We've got plenty of avenues, and they can donate just via GoFundMe. So it's pretty straightforward. And I think it's easy to forget that actually, when we talk about within fundraising, every little helps. At the moment, the exchange rate pound to rand is, I think it's about 1 to 24. So if you donate £10, 240 rand is a significant amount of money. And some of those things. So, for example, the £1,900 that we raised last year from our second House of Hope will pay for a music and dance teacher twice a week for 6 months at the House of Hope. So that's amazing access to those opportunities for those kids who come from backgrounds perhaps where they don't get the opportunity to access that normally.
Would you say that the House of Hope Sevens is sort of, obviously, because you're the director of Saracens Amateur Rugby, and the House of Hope Sevens was started in legacy of your grandfather. Would you say the House of Hope Sevens itself has sort of embedded itself into the Saracens amateur rugby DNA in some ways?
Yeah, I'd like to think so. I think, we get really good buy-in. We put out, whilst we, and I mentioned earlier, play level 8, we put out a team into the men's open as well. So whilst that's level 7 and above, we put out our highest ability side that we can probably pull together, but generally will be quite competitive in that competition. And then we have the team in the social as well. So we put 2 teams into the day, which is great. And again, from the kind of viability of grassroots rugby, hosting these tournaments also means that the club bar is open, so that's obviously generating revenue for the rugby club as well that we can reinvest back into the rugby here. A lot of the food vendors really, really kindly offer kind of 10% of their take across the course of the day as well to put into the pot. So by the end of it, once we've got entry, and the entry for the competition is £140 for a squad of 14, it's £10 per person. Is relatively inexpensive compared to a lot of other sevens tournaments in and around the same time, especially in London. And I think, it's a lot of sevens tournaments are great. Don't get me wrong. I love going to them myself. I play for a sevens rugby team as well. But I think this one has that real nice, authentic touch to it that people know that by contributing and playing, they are contributing to a greater cause as simply just playing sevens for enjoyment.
Yeah, 100%. I see similar stories across a lot of the Asian tournaments that I've been to and covered. There's a lot of really deeper stories and causes behind the tournaments, and it's really a pleasure to see where all of that goes to in the end. So yeah, and then finally, is there any sort of final messages that you'd sort of like to leave for people on the podcast? Any words of wisdom that you've sort of learned over the years?
Put me on the spot. I don't know. I think, you mentioned, you actually asked me before, have I ever done any podcasts before? And I've done a couple, and I've kind of spoken about my story and my kind of personal journey as well. And I think from rugby, I mean, I get a lot of not stick, but a couple of raised eyebrows of how much I kind of give to the rugby club. And I think regardless of what your interest or passion is, whether it's a rugby, whether it's cricket, whether it's art, if you buy in, often that organisation will give you back tenfold. And I think, I create a lot of social media stuff for the rugby club about stepping into our story. And I do really mean that. I think, there's a lot to be said for being part of something and feeling like you belong. I think there's a lot of pressures in life, whether it's professional, whether it's personal, that can really take a strain on us. And I think if there's something that really makes you feel like you're a part of something bigger and kind of stronger collectively than you might feel at times individually. You know, I think that's a really special thing, and I think sport has to and always will be, I think, at the forefront of that.
Well, Jack, it's been truly an inspiring to hear even more depth about the sevens and the amateur rugby. It's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast today and discuss everything Lions, England, and the upcoming summer internationals. And I hope the Champagne Rugby followers have enjoyed this podcast. And if you want to, you know where to donate for the House of Hope Sevens, which will be taking place on the 13th of July, I believe. Is that correct?
That is the one.
And we will also be there attending, doing some media coverage for the House of Hope Sevens. So be sure to check out the videos on Champagne Rugby and House of Hope Sevens social media pages. And we'll catch you next week after we've seen some of the New Zealand England matches. Thanks for now, and catch you next time.